Today, in this series of introductions, I would like to introduce you to Jeffrey Gibson, born in 1972 in Colorado, a registered member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. He also has Cherokee ancestry, and he is one of the most successful artists in America, working in America today, but also happens to be one of the most successful Native American artists working today. Now, perhaps you were already introduced to Jeffrey Gibson in 2018 when his exhibition Like a Hammer appeared at Seattle Art Museum, and this is the titular object for that exhibition, a work that is one of a series he calls his Club Kids, a slightly smaller than life-sized figural object that is made out of elk hide and beading and sinew and wool blanket and fur and wood and other stuff. And this exhibition really introduced the Seattle area to Gibson's work. It was a treat for the eyes. You can see the brilliant colors Gibson uses, but it also dealt with some serious subject matter, and Gibson says he called it like a hammer because to be like a hammer means that you can build something up, but you can also demolish. And in his art, he does a little bit of both. Now, Gibson, although born in Colorado, was raised all over the world. His father was a civil engineer for the Department of Defense. They lived in North Carolina and New Jersey, but also in Vietnam, in England, in Germany. And so it wasn't until he was 16 years old in 1988 that his family settled in the United States, in the Midwest. So he did not grow up on a reservation. He did not grow up as a powwow dancer, for instance, but he was very attracted to the powwow. Now, this is not quite his tribe. This is not the Mississippi Band of Choctaw, it is the Oklahoma Band, but they had a better website. So it gives you the sense of the color, the regalia. So at 16, now Gibson was living where he could visit his relatives on the reservations much more frequently. He was much more surrounded by the powwow. He wasn't a dancer. He hadn't trained from toddlerhood to learn the steps and the songs, but he attended powwows and loved the dressing up, the public posturing, loved that it was an opportunity for young men to wear brilliant colors and extraordinary costumes, and that it was a kind of an ecstatic experience. The dancing is not simply on a dance floor, but the dancing is to connect you with something spiritually larger than yourself. And that was also something that Gibson found in rave culture. So coming from Europe, where clubbing, going out, hearing music, drinking was an important part of his life as a teenager, all of a sudden at 16, he's in the Midwest. He can't go out, he can't drink. There were very few all-ages shows in the late 80s, and so what he became a part of was an underground movement that began in the late 80s, flourished in the early 90s, of often kids, underage, who had events in construction sites or abandoned warehouses, illicit locations where you had to know someone who had the password, but then you could go in and there would be music and everyone dressed up in often gender-bending ways, brilliant colors, and the dancing was, just as with the powwow, ecstatic. It got you outside of yourself, made you feel part of a larger community. Ecstasy was the club drug of choice at these raves, but this was a culture that Gibson would become part of. He was also, from a young age, very interested in fashion. And these are some Alexander McQueen models from a period when Gibson was studying in London, and McQueen was the hottest artist of the city, and Gibson loved how McQueen borrowed from everywhere, from traditional English tailoring, but also from samurai armor and science fiction, and brought it all into his art, which happened to be making garments for the human figure. So these are all things that would go into an object like a hammer. And as I mentioned, he calls these his club kids, referring to that youth culture of the rave scene, but obviously referring to the powwow as well. Now, Gibson decided as a teenager that he wished to be an artist, and he graduated in 1995 from the prestigious School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Then he was accepted to the Royal Academy in London for his Master in Fine Arts, but he couldn't afford to go. Until he learned that his chief, the chief of the Mississippi Choctaw band, would underwrite his education in London, saying that if Jeffrey Gibson grew stronger as an artist, that made the whole tribe stronger. That made the chief a stronger chief. And so he was prepared to make that investment, which turned out to be a very solid one. So Gibson attended the Royal Academy in the late 1990s, and he was always extremely interested in painting. He was he graduated as a painter, but a painter who also adds objects and stuff to his paintings. In this case, it's silicone. But he was very drawn to abstract painting. This is his work, Camouflage. However, he had to reckon with the identity politics of his early career, which were that if he exhibited works like this, Camouflage from 2004, he was criticized by some people who said, hey, the Choctaw paid for your education. Why are you making works that have no references whatsoever to Native American culture? On the other hand, if he made works like All That Matters, where the central image is a kind of Indian Madonna and Child. You can see that the mother wears a headband that brings her into that arena. Well, then he risked being pigeonholed as a native artist and not a universal artist, a modern artist. And so he went through a challenging period in the mid-2000s. In fact, at one point, he took a bunch of the all of the abstract paintings in his studio and took a razor blade and cut them off of their stretchers. And he took them to the laundromat and he washed them again and again. That was how frustrated he was feeling with his output, how much he felt like he needed to do something, anything, to recharge him as an artist. In about 2007, that was beginning to work in three-dimensional objects like his fetish, which combines a rather abstract oil on canvas work with a sculptural object that is intended to be in front of the canvas. And his fetishes, well, the very word fetish brings up connotations of a sex shop, but also anthropologists use the word fetish to refer to the objects of spirituality of non-Western religions. And his fetish objects include here, there's a raven. Can you see it there? I don't know what it is, if it's metal, if it's plastic, if it's actually taxidermied and then painted. One of them included a bowling trophy, just things, found objects that had some significance to someone. And he began making what he called totems out of ordinary objects, in this case, planters from someplace like Home Depot, that are stacked bottom to bottom and lip to lip to create that totem-like form. Now, of course, totems are not part of Choctaw iconography. Totems belong to the Pacific Northwest. But Gibson, having seen European artists steal from African masks, from Pacific Islander art, and so forth, Gibson felt that as an indigenous artist, he had a better right to access the visual traditions of a whole range of indigenous people. But he was feeling very blocked in his painting around these years, and in fact, on his website, you won't find anything that is between 2009 and 2012. It's sort of a fallow period for him. And he had a fellowship in 2011, 2012 with the Joan Mitchell Foundation, a very prestigious fellowship for emerging artists. He also had a job at a museum evaluating the Native American collections to decide whether there were objects that this museum owned that needed to be repatriated to the descendants of the original makers because they were sacred objects to a particular tribe. But he found himself fascinated with a category of objects known as whimsies that were in the storerooms of the museum because no one would show them because they were too cheesy. And these were objects made by Native Americans, in this case, Iroquois, but not sacred. They are made for the tourist trade. So can you see that it says Niagara Falls in beading at the bottom of this object? It's a pincushion, probably, for newlyweds to take home after they've had their honeymoon at Niagara Falls. And Gibson felt a sort of a whimsy himself, this kind of out-of-place artist who was Native but didn't grow up Native. And he decided, he was also in therapy in these years, and his therapist told him that he needed to reconcile his head and his body, that he had all of this emotional turmoil about how he had to deal with racism, with homophobia, with other dark aspects of 21st century American culture, but he wasn't expressing it with his body. So his therapist encouraged him to go to a boxing gym and get some of his aggressions out. And so the coming together of all of these influences produced his breakthrough work, Everlast, which we see here. Everlast is an actual punching bag that Gibson has decorated. And you see the sort of muted, actually, colorful patterns above and below the logo. That is one of those abstract canvases that he had laundered in that period when he was so frustrated with his work. So he's now using it to decorate this punching bag. He's also using jingles and tassels and other decorative stripes and so forth. And a punching bag is something that has a lot of resonance. It could be symbolic of different things. So it is something that you hit, something in a gym, a really testosterone-soaked space that you get your aggression out on, as Gibson himself was doing. But as a gay man, he is also very critical of that particular kind of masculinity that is all about violence as a solution to one's problem. So he's making a pretty punching bag. But punching bag, colloquially, is a term that we use for someone who gets beat up on. Not physically necessarily, but for instance, people called Chris Christie Trump's punching bag. Not that Trump ever hit him, but that he was the butt of jokes and so forth. And Gibson conceived of Native Americans as European Americans' punching bag from the very beginning, from the moment that Christopher Columbus landed in 1492, and the native people were subject to being wiped out by diseases, being enslaved, becoming beasts of burden, being pushed off of their native lands to the tune of hundreds of broken promises. So Gibson wants to revitalize this idea, wants natives no longer to be a punching bag. Now, the title of the work is the brand of punching bag, Everlast, but that has resonances as well. 100 years earlier, it was believed that Native American culture was on its very last legs, that the Indians were dying out. And Edward Curtis felt it was his duty as a white photographer to go out and capture what remained of traditional Native ways before they were completely absorbed into mainstream American society. But of course, Native Americans have not died out. In fact, in the 60s and 70s, alongside the civil rights movement, was the American Indian movement that generated a tremendous amount of pride in traditional arts, native beading, for instance, weaving, song, dance, and so forth. And so Everlast has this meaning when it appears on the punching bags of, no, you're not getting rid of us. We will ever last. So here is a 2014 punching bag. This is our house. And he apprenticed himself to a traditional Native American bead worker to learn how to do the beading, the intricate designs that we will see him using. But then, now he has become so successful that he has half a dozen assistants who do that beadwork for him, some of whom are native artists who were trained in that beadworking from a young age. So he is continuing these traditions, but in a very different context, decorating punching bags like this one with lots of sinews. This one also uses a wool military blanket as part of its decoration, an object that also has some dark resonance among Native Americans. Those were the blankets that were believed to be deliberately infected with smallpox in order to wipe out Native populations who had no immunity. Gibson frequently uses song titles or lyrics as the titles of his work. In this case, I Put a Spell on You, the Nina Simone song that has been covered so many times, and it appears in the beading all around this punching bag. So you can see at the top, it's all I, and then put a spell, spell, spell on you, perhaps referring to ideas about shamans, about Native religion. And You Can Feel It All Over, which refers to a Stevie Wonder song, is this 2015 Everlast punching bag that is only black and white. And the song is, it's about love. It's a very upbeat one, but the object is one of his more somber punching bags. And there are other things you can feel all over. You can feel a beating all over. And so this has that, for me, undertone of violence, and even with its use of only black and white beading, racial violence. Manifest Destiny is one of his most elaborately fringed punching bags. This one has the word right on it, Manifest Destiny. And that was the 19th century doctrine that drove a great deal of United States policy, that it was the manifest destiny that was desired by a white European Christian God, that Europeans should gradually take over the entire continent of North America from sea to shining sea. It ignored the inconvenient fact that these lands were already inhabited by the natives who had lived there for thousands of years. It took the line that Europeans, being a more advanced culture, would be better stewards of the land. We all know how that turned out. It's this object that has been prettied up with the jingles and the fringes, but that expresses this very ugly dogma that had led to suppression and death of Native peoples. Now the jingles I should talk about, because they are objects that are part of powwow regalia, particularly starting with the Minnesota tribes, but now I think more universal. And originally those jingles were made and attached to dancers' costumes. They were made out of the rolled up can lids of aluminum cans that stored government issue food that was given to the reservations. So in the spirit of using every single part of a buffalo or a deer, they even used the can lids to adorn their dance costumes, and they make marvelous noises. Now they are manufactured in Thailand specifically for the powwow dancers. But you can imagine that if you hit one of these works of art, it would jingle. If I Ruled the World, Seattle Art Museum now owns, and it too is from a song, but it also asks us all to imagine how we would arrange things if we had power, if we ruled the world. What might that look like? Having worked on the punching bags for a few years, Gibson felt the need to make objects that were more overtly figural, and that out of that arose his club kids, like a hammer that we saw before. This one is Come Alive, I Feel Love. And it's made out of, again, this array of different materials, beading, rawhide, jingles. Oops. I have some details that we'll look at in a moment, but the title, I Feel Love, is from Donna Summer from 1977. And even if you just look at the text of this disco album, that kind of graphic is something that continues to influence Jeffrey Gibson. So just to look up close at Come Alive, I Feel Love, we can see the jingles that are used in a way that they don't move to create the headdress here. We can see the beading, the arrowheads that are dangling down along his, just to go back so you can see where those are in this area here. And we can see the rawhide as well, very overtly traditional Indian materials. And these are probably not actual arrowheads that were found, that were made a century or more ago, but rather the ones that are made for tourist shops, but incorporated into this figure of a youth, a dancer, someone who is inspired by those ecstatic dance movements, and in form, the club kids rather resemble Kachina figures, like this one. The Kachina doll is Hopi. And of course, again, Gibson is not Hopi. He's not from the Pueblo tribes, the Southwest, but he is incorporating a wide variety of native influences into his work. Birds of a Feather has black and white, and the colors, the black, green, and red of the African, the Pan-African Unity flag. And so here, Gibson is sort of establishing solidarity with other people of color, with African Americans, with all of those who are others in mainstream European society and should therefore flock together. And again, you can see just going from something like Birds of a Feather to these images of the powwow, you can see how these objects evoke the color, not quite the sense of movement of these objects. The club kids are still very static, but this sense of self-decoration and self-presentation, that he also found among the rave community that he was part of in the late 80s, early 90s. So after making those youth figures of the club kids, Gibson felt drawn to making figures that evoked elders in his community, the chiefs, the shaman figures. And he happened to have, in 2015, a fellowship with a ceramic organization. So he'd never worked in ceramics. He'd done a little bit in art school, but it was not a medium that he had a lot of experience in. And he decided to make the heads, to make the heads of these shaman figures out of glazed and fired ceramics. And while the club kid heads are very abstract, they often have no eyes, no features at all, they are at least round and proportional to the rest of the figure. The shaman figures are more misshapen, even sinister looking. This one has crystals around its neck, as you can see, and the words, "Speak to me in your way so that I can hear you," are beaded right into the decoration. And he's using driftwood as the limbs of this figure. This one is called "I Can't Take My Eyes Off of," or "Can't Take My Eyes Off of You," another song title. Again, he's using a ceramic head, a cloak that is beaded and fringed and jingled, and then a wooden inner structure. But in this case, the tripod that is the body is made from actual teepee poles. So these were what Plains Indians would cover with skins when they erected their teepee homes, and that would, when they would then move from one camp to another, they would gather everything up, carry along the teepee poles on horseback. So the very teepee is a sort of this symbol of domesticity, of tradition, to create this figure. This one is "all for one, one for all," a reference to the Three Musketeers, and it goes back to the driftwood of the kind of tripod holding it up, but again to that idea of unity, of Gibson utilizing jingles from the Minnesota tribes and Iroquois beading and Plains teepee poles and Hopi Kachina figures and so forth, that they should not be separated. They should have unity. And sometimes he would simply make the heads. So this one he calls "They Whisper." And the tongues are up there. The eyes are looking up. So we can imagine this as a head that's sort of thrown back. And the tongues doing the whispering. So it could be ecstatic, a kind of speaking in tongues experience this could refer to in conjunction with the shaman themes of the figures, but it also could be gossip, something less lofty. What do you want? When do you want it? is the title of this figure that again uses a recycled wool army blanket and all sorts of fringing, jingles to create what is this rather intimidating figure. This is not a comfortable looking figure. But the title, which he would repeat, well, what you see here, and what is that under there? More washed canvas from those aborted mid-2000 paintings that had so infuriated him. And you can see here the rickrack and the studs and the beading. And the title also appears in this banner. And this is not so much a song as a chant. Anyone who has ever been at a protest in the last 50 years or so will have shouted, what do we want? Freedom, equality, whatever it is. When do we want it? Now. And these are the questions that Gibson is posing in the written part of his work. But here there's no figure. It is simply a two-dimensional, repurposed army blanket with that slogan, and it's kind of red, white, and blue, and black. And it hasn't been that long that just words have been considered a work of art. It goes back to the Dada movement of World War I era. But one artist that Gibson is particularly inspired by is the African-American artist Glenn Ligon, whose untitled I Am an Invisible Man you see here. Ligon's work of art is the preface to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, written in black on white, but written in a way in which the black begins to gradually obscure the text so that towards the bottom, we can't read it at all. All we see is the black, except for that one word, not. Ligon's refusal, Ligon's resistance. So a very important artist to Gibson. So Gibson begins making these wall hangings that are inspired by Chilkat blankets, products of Pacific Northwest indigenous culture. And this one says, American history is longer, larger, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. JB. And the JB is James Baldwin, another American of color, another gay man who felt like he was on the outskirts of his society but needed to comment on that society. And so Jeffrey Gibson is very much influenced not just by Native American, but also by African American culture, as we've actually already seen with the Donna Summer and the Stevie Wonder and so forth. This is a Tlingit Chilkat blanket out of mountain goat wool. This is its traditional format. In Numbers Too Big to Ignore is not quite in that format, but looks like a Navajo blanket. The design, the red and white and black, it looks like native weaving. But then we get down to the bottom and read in Numbers Too Big to Ignore. Well, that's a line from Helen Reddy's anthem, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, in Numbers Too Big to Ignore. But what it refers to here is the fact that Gibson, wherever he went in Native American communities, whether it was his family's own reservation, whether it was the Southwest, the Northwest, or Canada, wherever, he heard stories about someone's sister or cousin or ex-wife who was just missing, who had vanished without a trace. And it became evident to natives much more quickly than it became evident to the rest of society. There was an enormous problem that Native American women were going missing, were victims of murder, of trafficking, were simply disappearing in numbers too big to ignore. So Gibson wants us to not ignore it and puts it out to the art world, people with power perhaps to do something about it. Burn Baby Burn is the one that looks most in format like a Chilkat blanket, and takes the refrain of the disco song Disco Inferno for its title. But here, he's talking about the planet, climate change, the rise in temperatures, in wildfires, and so forth, that he wishes us to be aware of. Now, Gibson never lost his love of abstract painting, but he felt that pressure when he would make something purely abstract, that he wasn't being Indian enough. So he decided to paint on elk hide. That would be plenty Indian. This is his Someone Great Is Gone from 2013. But he also wishes the art world to know that within Native culture, there is a strong tradition of abstract design, of what looks like minimalist design. He created this work by stretching the elk hide over an ironing board and calling it a shield. But he said when he saw the antique ironing board in a junk shop, he thought of his grandmother and all of the hours she had spent ironing and washing and cooking and cleaning and being the rock of her household, and that ironing board could also become a shield, reminded him of the power of his grandmother and of Native American women in general. Head On may be a tribute to his grandfather. He took an antique shaving mirror and covered the reflecting part with deer hide, and then painted that with those brilliant, hard-edged, abstract designs, so that we can no longer look into this mirror and see our own reflections. We see rather this convergence of the Native American materials and the very modern colors and patterns. And sometimes Gibson just wants to paint an abstract painting, and feels like, as a human being, he should be allowed to paint whatever it is he wants. And yet, sometimes the traditional culture, the Native American meanings, trickle in regardless. So this is his work Upstream, which might make us think about fishing rights. And it is 6 triangles in cool colors, blues and greens, pointing upward against red triangles that point downwards, hot colors. So classically, in the language of 20th century abstraction, we've got push-pull going on here. We've got hot colors pushing out at us, blues receding, although it doesn't really act that way in this particular work. But we also have references to Kenneth Nolan's chevrons, to the history of minimalist art, and also, I think, to someone like Escher, whose birds go in opposing directions, but perfectly embedded in one another, just as they do, just as the triangles in Upstream do. Arrowheads, another reference, perhaps, for this work, and something we've seen him using in the past. And in something like Horizon, where we get a horizon line, we get that deep blue sky that is just before dawn or just after sunset. Here, the rows of triangles might well remind us of teepees and of the ways Native Americans have been portrayed by Western artists. In The Love You Keep, Gibson is again covering, well, he's covering a skinning board. He's covering an object that his ancestors might have used for preparing hides. But he's covering it with beading, but in patterns that are not Native American, but rather from a different indigenous tradition, that of Australia. So he's drawing on the curves and dots of Aboriginal, in this case, modern Aboriginal acrylic painting for works like this one. Not limiting himself to Native American culture, but drawing on indigenous cultures from all over the globe. Now, around 2018, Gibson felt like his work was too static. He wanted it to move, like the rave dancers or the powwow dancers. And so he began to design garments that could be worn. And the very first one that he made for himself to perform in, to dance in, weighed almost 100 pounds. It was quite a workout to be in that garment, so he has progressively lightened them. This one's Stand By Me, the title of a song and a popular movie. And this one, Without You, I'm Nothing, uses fabric that was specially made with photographs of his own works. There's the beading part in the center. Do I have a, yeah, there's the beading part, but you can see above and below the beading, this is fabric that he has had printed with the figure of one of his club kids. He's also influenced by Nick Cave, another gay artist of color who makes wearable art, whose sound suits, which were exhibited here at Seattle Art Museum a little over a decade ago, are not meant to stand around in a gallery. They are meant to move, to dance, to be part of an experience. Radiant Tushka is this club kid from 2014 that becomes the basis of this garment from 2018, where images of Radiant Tushka are printed onto this custom chiffon, so very lightweight, but the bodice of this garment is the center of a quilt, an antique quilt that was, you can almost see how damaged it is. It was worn out. It was no longer, it was going to be discarded. He repurposes the star pattern for his radiant tushka, Tushka being a town in Oklahoma on a reservation. So a place that perhaps most of America wouldn't consider radiant, that becomes radiant in the glow of the powwow and of Native American tradition. So Gibson, oh, there, I do have a, you can see radiant tushka printed on that very light fabric. He more recently has been using found objects to create helmets and to incorporate those into his works. And I should mention with the garments that Gibson has also become very involved in video and performance art and installation, all things that are challenging to capture in PowerPoint. But if you get to the Portland Art Museum by the end of this month. There is a big Jeffrey Gibson installation right now happening in Portland called They Come From Fire, honoring the local tribes of that area. But it involves video and costumes and a whole installation. Found objects continue to enter his visual vocabulary. The Spirits Are Laughing was made about a year ago. It looks like a 1950s robot in a comic book. It's a rather approachable object, but he also began to incorporate these helmets in two-dimensional works in paintings, but this one's got buttons and a David Bowie lightning bolt, and it's smiling at us, but the spirits are laughing may not always be a good thing. Sometimes they are laughing at the folly of humanity, because if they don't laugh, they would cry. He began about 5 years ago to make images that incorporate text, but text that is much more difficult to read than the beaded banners that he was making previously. He kind of invents his own colored shapes for this text. And the title of this work is Dance for Me. And those words are repeated 3 times in the fabric of this work. Can you see them? So I have a detail that they start there. Dance for me, dance for me, dance for me. But it's very abstract. So when we get a little closer, you can see that's a D. That purple triangle is an A. A rectangle bisected by a diagonal becomes an N. And 3 green stripes on top of 2 red ones, that's an E. So in a way, each of these is its own little minimalist painting, but it is also an alphabet that Gibson has devised that rhymes visually with these traditions of native beading patterns that make the frame of this work. So he began to create custom frames for his paintings, and he's also using pigment print on cotton. So he's printing. It's a photographic process, but he's printing this image, which is not of one of his own works. It's not one of those club kids, but rather it's something more like that whimsy. It's an object that was made by Native Americans for the tourist trade of a drummer. And that dance for me is, it's complicated because in this case with these little figurines, he's also referring to the commodification of Native culture, how Westerners have wanted the natives to dance for them, to perform for them. But it's also this brilliant, psychedelic, fun work that calls upon disco and those brilliant colors of the rave and so forth. So there is a ton in all of Jeffrey Gibson's work to consider. So I want to leave you with this 2018 piece. All I'm asking is for a little respect. The immortal words of Aretha Franklin. Done in that visual text of colors that he has created, so that the A is simply a triangle and so forth. So it isn't easy to read. We have to try to read it. And Aretha was asking for respect for women. Gibson is asking for respect for Native Americans, for the queer community, for the youth community that just want to dance and live their life. And he says that in this, as he puts it, hyper-divisive, politicized time, his art is an example of coexisting in a loving and generous way. But it's also the planet itself that Gibson thinks deserves our respect. And he said, quote, "My intention is in earnest to speak to the land. We can see harming the land as harming our bodies. When we harm the land, we are harming our own livelihoods and our lives. If we truly treated the land as an extension of our body, especially these days when self-care just means getting a facial, if we instead thought of self-care as planting trees, taking care of animals, and finding alternative energy sources, I think that's what self-care should be," end quote. So Jeffrey Gibson wants us to respect the planet, to respect our own bodies, to respect each other, to respect different cultures. And as an artist, he has reached a pinnacle of achievement where in that arena at least, Jeffrey Gibson receives a tremendous amount of respect. Thank you.
So we have some time for Q&A, and we're going to say goodbye to the students. They need to get back to school.
Bye, students. Thank you for coming.
So if there's any questions, I can get you a mic.
Any questions or images you'd like a second look at? Or not?
I have one. Where is he now?
New York City. He's based in New York City, and has a team of assistants who work for him in the hope of breaking out themselves. But yeah, his work sells for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the complexity. Yeah.
I just want to see the image again of the piece that looked like a skateboard.
Oh, yeah.
And it was 66 inches by 15. That one, yeah.
Yep.
Can you describe what it is?
So what it is a Native American skinning board that is underneath the beads and the felting and so forth. So it's 3 inches taller than I am, and it's a flat piece of wood that would have been used for preparing a hide. So for scraping the hair off of the hide, for stretching it, and so forth. So it was something that the Plains Indians use. Yeah, it looks like a skateboard. It's much larger than a skateboard, but it's that basic shape. But it was a functional object in earlier Native American culture that, like the punching bags and other things that he deals with, he has turned into a completely decorative object.
The next to the last image.
Mm-hmm. That one? So yeah, that's the detail of Dance for Me, where we can see the actual lettering and see this photograph that he has reproduced and then painted on and incorporated into the work. Yeah, it's pretty great.
You know, with that one, I'm looking at it, it's like, where does it connect from the cotton into the canvas? 'Cause if he prints on the cotton, you know, he's done it so, there must be, because he's printing on the cotton, but he's painting on the canvas.
So it looks like maybe right here. Can you see that there are some horizontal lines
Oh, okay.
that look a little buckled there? I suspect that's where it's overlaying the
Right.
canvas and it's been glued on or attached in some
And
way.
then painted over, yeah.
But it's kind of a collage. And then the whole thing.
Is there much discussion on some of those later abstract works being influenced or reminiscent of quilts and like quilting patterns in the West?
So it's something that I didn't talk about, but I think it's another aspect of Gibson's art as a whole. So we saw, wait, where was it? It's Radiant Tushka. We see him incorporating a quilt. But yes, absolutely, these abstract works, each triangle of which is a patchwork of different colors. Yes, there is an influence from patchwork, and that the fact that Gibson was making banners that look like weavings that are sometimes on actual blankets. He's making what was considered craft, but not art. He's incorporating that into the fine arts. And traditionally, a lot of those anonymous textile objects, if not the vast majority of them, were made by women. And there are gay artists like Jeffrey Gibson, like Nick Cave, who talk about their fascination with textiles from a young age, with the things that the women in their families were constructing. It's true of like Alexander McQueen as well. And so yes, and that is it's part of what the feminist movement did in the 70s to get textiles and so-called women's work accepted in the realm of fine art. Yeah. Yes, looks like. I can't think of any artist that, one is Lichtenstein. Roy Lichtenstein's comic book images are, I'm trying to think if I think they're titled things like Rat-a-tat-tat, or I think I'd rather drown than ask Brad for help is untitled, but sometimes those words that appear on a pop art work, like a Lichtenstein, are the title. But it is singular how much the title appears. So we don't have to look at the wall label to figure out what this work is called. We get it right from the work of art itself. Yes? Let's see. Here's Radiant. No, that's not Radiant Tushka yet. Actually, I'm not sure if there are words on Radiant Tushka. We do have a detail of it. Yeah, I don't think there are any words on Radiant Tushka. So I must have misspoken.
I think what you said was it was the print of one of his pieces of work.
So this is the club kid that is printed onto the fabric. That is Radiant Tushka, which is this, sideways, to form those bands on that red chiffon. It's printed on there, but it's the image, not the words. Well,
Anybody else? Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Get to Portland if you have a chance. There's also, I think it's still up, there's also a really interesting show by a mid-20th century modern Indian artist named Oscar Howe, who was also criticized for not making work that was Indian enough. That's a really interesting exhibition. So, thank you.